Let's talk about user experience and user interfaces. Right, so we want to look at what do we mean by user experience, what we mean by user interfaces. One is perhaps strategic, one of them is perhaps tactical, and then see what the differences are. We all use interfaces, not only digital ones with the laptops and our gadgets, but we use interfaces in all sorts of everyday life, right? When we sit in a car, when we interact with a monitor or even a chair or anything that we touch, there is some interaction between you and whatever it is that you're interacting with. And a lot of effort goes into deciding how things should look and how things should operate. And some of them have, over the years have evolved, and we have optimized many of how things should behave, and so that perhaps cars for the last couple of decades have become this abstraction that they're all pretty much the same. You can expect pretty much the same behavior from them, right? Just need a wheel, a couple pedals, and maybe a couple gauges, and you're done, right? As technology evolves and cars start to drive by themselves, then perhaps we'll have to rethink if even an interface is needed, or if is it a voice interface? How is it that you're going to interface with these things? So some interfaces that we have today are just temporary interfaces as we progress through a particular technology. Eventually, I'm guessing we won't even have phones, right? We'll have some brain interface that we won't need to scroll or select or anything like that. That will all go away. And some interfaces have gone through several iterations that have become so widespread or so ubiquitous or so generic that everything now is just a rectangle, right? So you have a tablet or a laptop or a phone, and they're all rectangles. So a lot of the same icons that had in years past of a television or a phone or something that we picked up, something physical, those have become stale or no longer have any meaning. So interfaces evolve over time as technology evolves, and we have to just keep up with the changing times. Anybody had used ever one of these? I did. I'm old enough to know what these are. And there's a lot of effort went into designing these things, and a lot of things we never actually use. This blinking 12. I don't know if I ever looked at the time and all the effort that went into making the clock in there. Today, people don't use watches, or we typically use a phone to look at the time, and we just perhaps buy an Apple Watch only for other purposes other than just timekeeping. Some interfaces are just really bad interfaces, are contradictory. Might seem contradictory, like garbage only, no trash. What was it that was meant, or what was the context in some of this? And it's very, very common that you find things are just funny to read at and are totally nonsensical, or sometimes really hard to understand exactly what you mean on what the relationships are. How you lay out different things on certain corners, not representing what you intended. Is the rooms to the left? Is this rooms to the left or the right? Depends how you parse the image on how you would interpret these things, especially depending on different cultures, where in certain cultures you read from left to right, from top to bottom, whereas in other cultures you read from a completely different way, right? And depending on that culture, you might interpret this in a different way. Some interfaces are fairly well designed. It captures the right level of abstraction, that it filters out all the noise that we don't really care about, all the details that we don't care about, and only captures the essence of what we need. We don't really need to know that these are not really straight lines, right? That they wiggle around in and out, and same thing with the green line. It just captures the abstraction of the sense that this is it goes one way or the other, and that's all we really need to know. So some interfaces are really good, are able to capture lots and lots of information, rich information, in a small amount of space. So it's very, very hard to really come up with something that is very, very useful, such as perhaps this one. So what is it? What is the difference of user experience and user interfaces is that your user experience takes into account the entire the entirety of the experience of the user as they interact with an entire application, whereas user interfaces are just a tactical way that you or technique that you would use to achieve some user experience of following certain color schemas or being consistent across the entire all the different screens. But user experience is a higher than that. It's a more strategic point of view of how is that you're going to translate what the functional requirements are into something that is consistent, that it's pleasant, that folks understand what is that they're using, that is perhaps minimalistic, that it takes into account who is actually using this. Is this a system administrator, or is this someone who's who's not very savvy, technical savvy, right? Is this somebody who can consume a lot of information at once, or is this somebody who can only read one paragraph at a time? Can we throw at them all sorts of tons of information with lots of tables and scroll bars and whatnot, or is this somebody who we need to create maybe a wizard where we walk them one question at a time? So these are the kinds of questions that a user experience engineer asks themselves. Puts the user, right? Who's our audience? Ask ourselves, who's our audience, and then let's build an application around that particular audience, right? So it puts, as this says, right, puts the end user at the center of the universe, right? And every decision of the user interface is based on that policy. And so over the years, we've identified certain aspects, certain techniques, certain scientific methods that we can measure the efficiency or the efficacy of some user interfaces versus some other user interfaces, and we've been able to create a body of principles, right, of best practices, which now fall under the umbrella of human-computer interaction as a research focus, right? And how is that we can build something that is useful? It's funny that let's see, 20 years ago maybe, when I was going for my doctorate in my human-computer interface class, one of the things that we're discussing, this was prior to iPhone, and we were discussing about direct manipulation of a list, right, of somebody actually grabbing the scroll bar and moving it around and being able to scroll an entire document. And most folks thought that was an efficient way of manipulating the content, of manipulating the screen, that nobody would actually want to grab the content and just drag it around. And now it turns out that it's the main way that we interact with any screen, with a flick of a finger. Back then, it was thought of it's ludicrous, and it turns out to be actually one of the better ways that today we interact with our data, direct manipulating the data. So things change over time of what we might think of best practices at one point, but then when you actually try it, so there's no substitute on trying something, right? Of building something and folks trying it out and giving you some feedback. So as I mentioned earlier, a user interface is a more of a tactical or a set of techniques that that work on the behalf of a user experience of a more strategic application of these strategies to achieve a good user experience. So why even bother? Spending time and effort in a good user interface or a user experience? So money talks, right? There's a lot of money involved. There's tons of really good products that end up not being used correctly, or being returned, or folks just calling on the phone because they can't figure out the user interface. Lots of time and effort and money goes into is reflected on bad user interfaces, right? That if you don't spend the money and the effort and the research up front at coming up with some user interface that is understandable, you'll eventually have to pay it down the line, right? On somebody calling on the phone and asking for help, or and you having to have some call centers, fielding all these questions, or folks just being frustrated and returning the product, even though it was a fine product. It wasn't broken. It's just that folks couldn't understand how it operated. Also, there's also a time a time factor, right? As folks evolve over time on how they might want to interact with whatever it is that they're consuming. Some of the you might remember the Diamond Rio and so many other players, music players that came along that were building on some prior successes, such as the Sony Walkman. I don't know if anybody remembers what that was. That they were trying to replicate perhaps that success, right? But creating a digital version of that, and trying to build on that success. And some of the things that the familiarity of folks with those products, that perhaps was a good idea to try and translate a lot of the effort that folks had put into those kinds of technology, and just bring that over to the next generation. And it was very successful, quite a bit, until someone thought of a completely different way of consuming the same content, where folks, in the prior one, folks were consuming a song, right, or consuming a particular song, and they were burdened with having to maintain their own set of songs. Whereas Apple kind of came on board and introduced a completely different way of interacting, and it was a huge success, even though perhaps it wasn't building on the success of anyone. It was coming up with a completely different way of interacting with these. Same way when the iPhone first came out, and Steve Jobs flicked the screen up. It was so obvious, right? Once you saw it, it says, wait, why? Somebody must have thought of this already. It was obvious once we saw it, right? And you see all the phones before and after iPhone that really struck. As opposed to all phones prior, they were trying to cram an entire operating system, the Windows operating system, into a small screen. Right? They were trying to perhaps carry over a lot of the things that we were already familiar with that worked well on large devices, right, on large screens, that didn't work as well in smaller screens. Right? That we had to reinvent an entire vocabulary, an entire set of gestures that would allow us to interact in a completely different way. And the stock just went through the roof. What Steve Jobs perhaps is best known for is being able to marry these two ideals of good technology and also the good experience, the overall experience of whatever product it is. It wasn't a veneer. It's not the user interface. It's the entire experience of how it feels in your hand. On feeling that it's a robust, and it's even it might not be, but it carries that aura. So designing is really hard. It's otherwise everybody would be doing it, and it all revolves on taking the place or being in the shoes of the end user. Right, not as opposed to what a lot of us do on blaming the user, or perhaps using phrases such as instead of a user, maybe a loser, or that there's a problem with the user. They're just too dumb to be able to understand what it is that we're building for them. Folks might have many different interpretations of what we ask them to do, or they might have a literal interpretation of what it is that we're asking to do. So we have to take all these things into account on, again, looking at it from the point of view of the end user, who our audience is, right? Also, as engineers, right, we tend to be much more technology savvy than most of the population. So none of us are representative of any of the folks who might be using our technologies, right? You can throw at us a lot of information all at once, and we could perhaps process it. Not so with an end user or client, right? The more tools and the more features that you can cram into a square rectangle, the better. We love all these all the capabilities, whereas our end users might be completely overwhelmed, right? Just take my assignments. Right, I feel that I'm providing a lot of information. That there's a lot of learning experience in there, but it perhaps is too much to consume an entire week. Right, so certainly some of that feedback could be that perhaps I could be less verbose. Yeah, so the solution is, it might be easily captured as in, well, try and be in your user's shoes. Look at it from their point of view. What is it that they need, right? What is their natural use? Trying to help them avoid trouble. So these aspects, these principles are easily expressed, but very, very hard to do very well, right? Especially when we cannot agree, not even agree, what a user is. If you say, well, put the user in the center of the universe, well, who is the user? What is our actual audience? And that's one of the most difficult parts, is defining who your audience is. And some of the folks that are able to define this very well will have probably much more success than others, right? For instance, Apple at the beginning might have decided that their audience was going to be maybe the teachers, or they're going to be some folks who are in the education business, right, or the graphic design business, and they grabbed a subset of the population, right, and once they understood their point of view, they really targeted on that particular sub demographics, right, and say, well, these folks are not going to they're not going to need this, that, or the other, right? So let's really focus our efforts on and try to achieve and solve 80% of what they need, right? Even though we're going to leave out all the power users that sometimes get frustrated because you can't do some simple stuff that you could do on Unix or that you could do on Windows, because you have full control of the machine, right? So they would hide a lot of the stuff, even from iPhones and whatnot, right? They'll hide a lot of some of the more powerful features because that's not their audience, right? They're very good at targeting a particular set of audiences, and as the audience progresses, they might open up here and there certain features, plus some strategic, some cannibalization that they might try to avoid with their own products as well, obviously. Yeah, so there is no one user, right? So and there's no way to please everybody, right? Users, any particular variable that you grab, there's always going to be folks on one side of that variable and then some other side of that variable. And there's lots of variables that you can measure, how their capabilities on memory retention and how long can they be attention, or their ease of learning and processing visual and audio perception. I mean, there's all sorts of variabilities in the demographics that you might choose, right? Different senses of style, different cultures that they may come from, different languages, different sensitivities that you have to take into account. Very, very hard. There's no one user. So that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Who is your target audience? Also, I mean, there's all sorts of physical differences between folks. The population. Is it you might come up with a user interface that 10% of the audience that is your target audience can't even use it, right? Where because they might be colorblind, that they might not be able to distinguish between red and green, right? Even though it's a user interface that is widely used, all over the world, right? And they've made the decision that it's not it's not worth, right, the effort to try and target this minority audience, right, that folks might look for other clues to to be able to use and overcome their particular handicap. Yeah, so there's no one use, right? There's no one size fits all. You can have different products for different types of users, multiple sizes. It's not possible to optimize. Oftentimes we look for ways to optimize, but but usually that optimization assumes that the user is aware of a particular context, of a particular culture clue, and skipping a whole bunch of steps that we might assume that the user is aware of. Just like somebody might explain some mathematical calculation. They might start and give some general steps and skip over a whole bunch of them, assuming that the person is following along and is aware of some of this, right? Same thing here, right? If you're trying to optimize, usually is at the expense of skipping or making lots of assumptions on who your audience is. So how is it that we can integrate the design phase of user interfaces into our overall process? So we've taken a look at some of the different software engineering methodologies. Certainly, there's the traditional waterfall. Now, the traditional waterfall, one of the problems with the traditional waterfall is that if you early on you design a user interface and whatnot, it might be that by the time this is released, the requirements might have changed, and folks, even the technology might have changed, right? And the needs might have changed. There's no way to easily take that feedback and change the design of the user interface. It would be too late by the time you get to the release phase, right? There's no way. So what other ways that we looked at this is well, can we perhaps use iterative approaches where you take in that feedback and you iterate over the user interface, kind of like our agile way of doing our implementation. Now this approach doesn't work either, or doesn't work well either, since oftentimes this would entail using your end user or your client as a guinea pig, right? That you want to throw it out there as an incremental user interface to folks and kind of get their feedback. They're not gonna appreciate the fact that you're putting out something and you're using them as guinea pigs, and they're gonna get frustrated. So oftentimes we would like to be able to do this even earlier than that, even before our end user actually see anything, right? So it has to be as early as possible that we do some user testing, that we identify some proxies, some folks that can represent those clients, but not the actual clients, right? Some folks that have the same demographics, have the same age or gender or culture or memory retention that would serve as a proxy from the real user, and run some user testing, to see how they react before we go out and go out something with the client. So the spiral model is perhaps a better approach, where we can incrementally iterate over several versions of the interface. Perhaps start off with something really simple, something really inexpensive, perhaps some throwaway prototypes, right? That even on paper, where folks we can discern very quickly on whether to go one way or another, right? If we could just test some hypotheses on some of these user interfaces and really quick whittle down some of the options that we might have brainstormed early on. So the steps basically are identify who your user are, identify what it is that they're competent, and constantly revisit these two assumptions, or the hypotheses that fall from these two steps at the top. So basically what we want to be able to do is do some human-computer interaction studies, right, on some of these folks, and try to identify folks that meet the same ethnographics, maybe the same skill level, maybe the same knowledge and environment that real users might be in, right? That they are as real as they can be, right? Without actually using the end user and the client who's actually paying for this, right? And that they are representative of real users, so that they can give you some feedback, some really, really early feedback with some throwaway paper, very cheap and inexpensive prototypes, and give you some real early feedback on this. Again, there's a lot of questions that you need to answer on the user, what their experience might be, what is it they're trying to accomplish. Are they going to be using this often or just periodically, and on whether we're emphasizing more folks that we got to make it easy for them, that maybe we break it down in a wizard, as opposed to just dumping the entire content in a single page. So to be more efficient, are you tackling efficiency or ease of use? Oftentimes they're mutually exclusive, right? That what's the information that we need to make available for them, be able to complete their task and make it available to as many folks as you can. Now one of the best techniques to be able to gather this information from our end users is just sit down and have an interview, right, with these folks. But come prepared with some of the questions that might fall from some of the hypotheses that we might have from our target user, right? And perhaps come prepared with some prototypes and have some very specific questions that we might want to answer, and try to explain to them what is that we want them to achieve with those prototypes, and try to have them use that prototype as much as they can do on their own. Try not to give them clues. If they're going to fail, well, let them fail, because that's going to be a data point for us, right? That this just doesn't work. Right? If we lead them through the study as they interact with those prototypes, we're just cheating ourselves, right? We really want to see them. Where is it that they get stuck? Make very good notes on what is that they're working on, they're trying to achieve. Yeah, so you would plan all these studies in advance. Perhaps ask them if you could film them as they use the prototype, or film maybe you could they can agree to maybe be filmed at least as they use their hands, right, as they move the mouse, as they move the keyboards, as they interact with the tablet, to see where the stumbling blocks might be, and give them a particular set of tasks, right? That I wanna create a service and assign it to a provider. That might be a task. Or I like to create a frequently asked question, or I like to be able to add a question for a service, right? So give them a specific task, right, and give them the 2, 3, or 4 screens that they would need to use this, right, to achieve that goal, and then says, well, if this were your goal, how would you use this user interface to achieve that? And have them stumble as they click and drag and just poke at the interface. Again, not leading them, right? Not cheating, and making notes on where they get stuck. And ideally, we would ask them to think out loud, right? As they interact, as they move their hands, think out loud. What is that they're thinking, so that we can make those notes and have a look in their heads, as they're struggling through this. We could have some paper prototypes, just with cardboards or something that we draw on paper, or some cardboard that capture the overall feel of what the product might be, with some buttons and scroll bars and whatnot. It doesn't have to be fancy. Studies show that things that are even fancier don't necessarily give us any better any better data, right? That paper and cardboard prototypes seem to be just as good as anything that we would give them, with actual dummy plastic or something that looks or fancy graphics or anything like that. There doesn't seem to be any better data that we can gather from any fancier. It could be just as well something just drawn on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, just to point out as they click. And we might have several of these in multiple PowerPoint slides that when they click and when you drag, they can either show them a different PowerPoint slide, or it could be just a different paper, right? As they click, we'll take out that piece of paper and put another piece of paper, right? And they interact with that, and we gather what is that they're trying to do as they interact with this. Again, studies have shown that using plain paper and something drawn on with a marker is just as good as something fancier that you might have built using HTML or something like that. It could be a little fancier, perhaps, with some cutouts, some boards that you draw, and that would show perhaps use of tabs, whatnot. You could maybe get a little fancier, and it doesn't have to be either something that you hold on a piece of paper on your hands. It could be something that is on a wall, right? It could be something big where you can interact with someone else, right? As they click through this, and they might have lots of these in different, just pasted to the wall. And as you interact with a particular user interface, you move on to some other whiteboard or some other cardboard that has the resulting interface that from that user event. Right? So you can get pretty creative. Or you can go ahead. There's tons of tools that allow you to drag and drop lots of these widgets that you can put together quickly, a wireframe like this. So for instance, in our assignments, I'm going to provide with some wireframes on what we're going to be working in the next sprint, right? And just as an idea of what it would look like, right? So the user experience engineer, most of its time and effort goes into designing these wireframes, right? Of what the experience might be, what the information that the user needs to be able to take some decisions. Is it all there, right? Is it clear? That the UI engineer, right, would then take these wireframes and actually make it look pretty, right? Make it look professional and polished, and maintain some consistency in the color palette and the fonts and whatnot across the entire interface. So user experience takes on the task of the overall experience of the user, whereas the user interface engineer might actually implement the look and feel of how something's actually going to look pretty. Some of the wireframes problems. Well, some of the advantages, right? They're inexpensive. They're easy to mock up. There's no need for coding these things, right? There's no need for me to know HTML or CSS or anything like that. I can quickly put together something just dragging a whole bunch of widgets, and it's easy that as feedback comes in from the end user, it's very easy for me to just rearrange things without having to code anything or be burdened with anything. So the good thing is that you don't have to code, and the bad thing is that you don't have any code at the end, right? You still have just some graphics, some very high level graphics. So it's good and bad. There's nothing for me to actually convert into something useful. Right, so let's take a look at now some of the design principles from some Jacob Nielsen. So Jacob Nielsen came up with some design principles that are fairly consistent across successful user interfaces that we would want to keep in mind as we are building our own user interfaces. One of them is match the real world. That's one of the that's one of the principles. As in, folks are gonna throughout their upbringing and day-to-day interaction with the real world, they will already be familiar with working with physical real systems that perhaps we can draw upon, right? That familiarity that they might have with the real world, if we could draw on that knowledge and bring some of that into our user interfaces with some kind of metaphor, we can have them understand very easily how is that it's supposed to work, right? So very common what Xerox did and Apple stole or borrowed, or the metaphor of using the desktop right, as a metaphor of how you interact with the data or that you generate or you interact with in the in a computer, right, of documents. Everybody can think of a document, and we came with we created all sorts of appropriate icons, right, to represent it as a sheet of paper, right, with a flap, and trash cans and folders, and all these metaphors were created in such a way that folks that were not technically savvy could now say, oh, I understand, right? Documents can go in a folder, right, as opposed to talking about paths and directories and files, right, in a file system. Now that just went above everybody's head. But when you use the metaphor of folders and documents, and folders can be inside of, documents can be inside of folders, then it's a metaphor that they can use from the real world and bring on to their and understand the computer in that way. Now, oftentimes this metaphor breaks, right? That there's no real map of something that is in the physical world. There's no one-to-one mapping on something that is in the metaphor. Like, for instance, you may be emptying the trash, right, or some other things that might have a logical representation but not a physical representation, right? Sometimes these metaphors break, and especially today, where more and more devices, are represented by just a rectangular slab, right? That there's no there's no difference between this rectangle and and the monitor also being a rectangle, and my screen also being a rectangle. There's no physicality about a phone having a handle or rotary, or this all that is being eliminated, and things are becoming less and less physical, right, and much more abstract. So a lot of the metaphors that we used to use way back when of maybe an icon representing a CD or an icon representing a floppy disk, right? These metaphors no longer work, right? Because the technology has progressed. So today everything is becoming much more abstract, right? Just a sphere or with a couple of lines through it, right? And that means and that means some messaging or message app, right? Everything's becoming so much more abstract. So these metaphors break, and sometimes these metaphors are hard to remove. I remember Apple went through that on their iPhone, trying to remove the note-taking application, right? The note-taking application for quite a while used the metaphor of the leather-bounded notebook, right? That had lines and whatnot. And that metaphor kind of was lost on folks that had never seen a leather-bounded notebook. Even though my wife has a whole bunch of them. So folks were saying, well, how do we remove all these metaphors and become more and more abstract? Windows, for instance, has gone ahead very headstrong on this idea that everything's a rectangle, right? Everything's these very abstract rectangles that make up applications and whatnot. So I think they're leading the front on that idea. Another principle that Nielsen talks about is as much as we can be able to provide direct manipulation of whatever data we're working on, as opposed to instead of using a mouse that provides some indirect manipulation of the data, providing perhaps a hands-on that I can actually touch and drag things around, right? One of the examples I often use is the difference between MapQuest. Anyone remembers MapQuest? No? Okay. So MapQuest, way back when, before Google Maps, right, provided an indirect manipulation way of interacting with maps, right? You had buttons, and you would click the right button or the left button to scroll left or right, pan right, or some other buttons to zoom in, zoom out. And so this worked fine for quite a while until Google Maps came in and introduced the direct manipulation. You drag, you grab the map directly, and you can jiggle around and you can flick it, right? And then it's such a much better experience that it took over the world. Folks says, wow. I mean, the first time I saw that was pretty cool. It says, why it wasn't always like that, right? Also, a lot of the a lot of the objects that we interact day to day, they have what are called, what sometimes we refer to as an affordance, that create some constraints that you can only interact with these objects in a particular way, right? Certain things are just for one thing, like a chair is for sitting, right, or breaking a window. But it has a particular affordance, right? It has a constraint on what it is that you can do with it, and by creating user interfaces that provide certain constraints, right, it minimizes the guesswork of what the user might use an interface for, right? So a back button, right? Well, it must be just for that, going back to where I was. It's the mental model that you create with certain constraints. So Nielsen suggests that we make use of these natural constraints. Right? One of the exercises that we used to use is that you're given 10 pieces of Lego, right? What can you build with it? Because of the way that the Legos are or the particular pieces that you're given, you only have certain ways that it could be arranged with no instructions. What can you build with it, right? But because of the particular pieces and the particular way that they interact with one another, it was only a very small subset of ways that they could go put together. Right? It wasn't an infinite number of choices. So you want to minimize the amount of effort that our users need to come up with and determine what is that you're asking us to do. Again, there's no one user. Right, and it's very hard to cater to everybody. I mean, take this course. It says half of you perhaps have taken co-ops, and perhaps and you might have already worked with some of the technologies, and the other half perhaps is struggling, trying to get some of these technologies to work. And so it's a very fine line that someone has to walk right between these two camps. And still make it successful, right? So it's very hard. There's no one. There's such a very varied number of folks and different skill levels. Also some of the aspects that we need to consider is what are the constraints that the world might give us, that might give us a clue on how is it that we can map certain operations, certain constraints, certain interface options, and be able to map them to actual outcomes from the system that we're interacting. For instance, we have the stove on the top, right, where you have the layout of the burners in one way, but the layout of the knobs that control those burners as a line. And my wife always gets it wrong. She always turns on the wrong knob and turns on the wrong burner, right? Because again, there's a disconnect between the way the user interface is disconnected from the physical layout of what it is that you're controlling, right? And certainly we like to consider how is it that we can lay it out so it's very clear, even if it's indirect. This is indirect. That it's apparent what controls what, right? The layout and the user interface have a one-to-one mapping. A couple other aspects that Nielsen discusses is the immediate response, that we have a feedback between our actions and what happens immediately. Right? Oftentimes, you have user interfaces that are very hard, where you make an operation, you click on something, and either because it's communicating with the server, or it's downloading some resource, or there's some time delay. That only a few, even milliseconds or a couple of seconds of delay, there's a disconnect between a particular event that we generated and the actual response of that system. So that delay makes it hard for us to create a mental model on what are the rules of engagement with that application, right? That that when you scroll, you expect the things to scroll right away, right? That when you drag, things drag. So certainly immediate visible effects are useful. Another of the big principles that Nielsen mentions is the consistency, right, in the standards. We are humans, and humans like to identify patterns, right? We like to we see enjoyment on looking at something and then be able to recognize it later on, right? That's That's why we like music, right? That's why we like certain beats, right? So that we learn them, and then when we are able to recall them and they match what we expected, we see joy in that, right? And so looking for these patterns, that it's the same fonts, the same color scheme, that things are laid out in a particular way, that things are aligned, that they're flush with one another, right? That the padding is the same, that the margins are the same. We see those patterns, and it just makes it that much pleasing to work with, right? If there's no consistency, that you go from one screen and it's laid out completely different from another screen, it's laid out completely different from another one, we don't see continuity, right? We think that everything is we have to relearn it once again, right? So, you're taxing our brains, right? Whereas if you see patterns, right, humans find enjoyment and a much easier use of your application. The other one is help. Whenever, ideally, at the point of that you need that help, that perhaps it's context driven. That depending on where you are, we might perhaps suggest certain topics that might help you. That maybe you can search for it, right? That as you type ahead, as you type, the application can provide certain topics that might be relevant to the task at hand. So it's task sensitive. Ideally, that won't even be needed, right? That you don't need this help, right? Because we're going to make every effort that it's self-documenting, right? That it's so obvious you're not going to need any help. Okay. The other one is user control and freedom. In that if you're in the middle of something, that you might want to be able to change your mind, or something you made a mistake, that you would be allowed to somehow go back to a previous setting or previous state of the application where everything was okay, right? That you might have painted yourself into a corner. You don't know how you got there, and you're able to go back to some safe state of the application where you are. So perhaps provide some kind of undo, right, or some way to backtrack your steps to where you were. Right? Also, some way to measure that the application is doing something, or if it's in the middle of something, that it gives us some kind of status, that it's in the middle of something, that it will at some point complete, right? That these progress bar are not fake, right? That they're not just spinning, right, making us believe that it's doing something, but it's actually not doing anything. It's just crashed, and there's no way for it to to just let us know that it'll never complete. Another one is to try and cater to more than one type of user. Perhaps obviously you want to cater to as many folks, but not to the point to make it that it's tedious to use, right? You might provide for those folks that are starting to use your application, you'll provide a wizard, right, that walks you step through step, right, on what is that you need to do. But once you've done it 10 times and you know what the steps are, then it becomes annoying, right? I would like for you to give me an alternative, more efficient way that I can just check, and I'm done, right? Without forcing me to always go through the same wizard. So have the application be able to adapt perhaps, or provide a couple of different ways of doing the same thing. One if you want hand holding, and I'll walk you through all the steps, but perhaps I can give you either a shortcut, or I might give you some way to accomplish the same exact thing, but in much more efficient. So these are very hard, right, where you want to be able to have both the flexibility and the efficiency, right? So it's hard to be able to do both. Another one is how much you tax the user's memory of having to remember things, right? That they might need to make a decision based on remembering how they got here, right? Or what is it that they were doing? That the application only gives you information about the current task, but it doesn't give you any context of where you are, right? Because either you looked away and had to talk on the phone, and then came back and you don't remember where you are, and the application doesn't give you any context. Or it provides some kind of abstract icon that means nothing to you, rather you have to remember what it is, right? So the more the application depends on you having to remember, right, the less enjoyable it is, right? So some of these icons might capture the essence of what they mean, but oftentimes they are very generic and are totally meaningless, right? That some of these, right? Error prevention. So first we talked about providing some help or providing ways to undo. Especially if you've painted your way into a corner and you've made a mistake or an error, and being able to backtrack. But instead, or in addition to, is trying to avoid or eliminate the causes of even having that error in the first place, right? Where you might give them controls or user interfaces that discourage or avoid the possibility of you making a mistake. So, for instance, if I'm asking for a date, I'm not going to give you a text input where you can type whatever you want. Instead, I'll give you a widget where you can only select the date, right? Or so that I minimize the cases where you might be able to enter some bogus data that I need to parse and realize that I cannot convert it into the correct data type that I need, right? And then I'll have to ask you to correct it. Well, then just give me something that will make me make that mistake in the first place, right? That it has the different context. If you're asking me for an email, right, then give me an email keyboard. If you're asking for a number, give me the number keyboard, right? If you're asking for a phone number and so on and so forth, right? Give me the an interface that is aware of what could go wrong and just eliminates any possibility of it going wrong. And if things do go wrong, provide some clue on what might have happened, as opposed to providing some generic, obscure message that might be only useful to the developer, but it would be totally meaningless to the end user, right? The end user might not care that it lost connections to some database or some core dump or whatever, right? So a lot of these messages need to be mapped to some end user. Something useful for the user to make some corrections and perhaps avoid or learn the application and then avoid it happening next time. And finally, the 10th idea is to just be careful on based on who your audience is. The amount of information that you might want to provide your user. You might overwhelm them. You might think you're doing some benefit to them by bombarding them with tons of information on the right hand side, whereas where perhaps you might lose or not quite understand what is the main core use case, right, of a search engine is to search something, right? And then providing all these other set of things that might distract the user from the main use case of what is that you're trying to do. Where Google, having an alternative, very minimalistic approach, where perhaps they might just want you to type something there. Now, obviously, there might be a happy medium between the two. Perhaps the very first time you went to Google, you didn't know what is it that you want me to type in there, right? So Google being Google today, yes, it can get away with just giving you a search bar, but perhaps at the beginning, we would like, what is it that you want me to type in here, right? So when you're Google, you can do that, but when you're not Google, perhaps you might want to provide some clue on what is it you want me to type in there, right? If you're Zillow, then perhaps you want me to type an address, right? If you're Yelp or you're some other folk, then you would give me some clue on what is that you want me to enter there. So there might be some happy medium between the two, or some clue what is it I want to type. So but anyway, the idea of just not overdoing and bombarding the user with more information that they might need. Testing the UI. Right, so you want to be able to come up with the UI, and put it in front of folks that represent real users, right? That somehow either demographically or skill set or attitudes or culturally somehow they represent the end user, and they're gonna have ideally the same mistakes or the same challenges from real users, and don't get into the attitude of blaming the user. You know that the user's telling you something, right? Those studies are giving you a clue that hey, I'm making you a favor of identifying these things early on, as opposed to finding them when after a lot of expense having to maintain this later on and try to fix this in the field. Avoid the attitudes of some project managers might says, where did you find these stupid users, right? Because you might have they might have some different mental model of who is actually going to use this, right? Or they might be reluctant in accepting that the design is wrong, right? That we need to fix something. That they might take the attitude that the design is right. It's just that the users are too dumb to use it correctly, right? So blaming the users. Very, very often we do this.